We have to learn to live as a society with our brothers. We cannot view our neighbor as our enemy. If I view my neighbor as my enemy, I want to destroy him. But if I view my neighbor as my brother, I want to see him flourish in society. The Marxist ideology turns you into different groups, and other groups are your enemies, so you want to destroy. And the Christian worldview says your neighbor is your brother, and it's your responsibility to lift him up. We have to make that basic philosophical decision in our Western nations, or we're going to start falling apart.
Hello and welcome to Freedom Feature. My name is Barry Bussey, and with me today I have a special guest, Dr. Conrad Vine, who's the chair of the Religious Liberty Committee at the Village Seventh-day Adventist Church in Berrien Springs, Michigan. Dr. Vine has studied a fair bit with the issue of biblical meditation, but he also has a tremendous interest in religious freedom. And it's on that basis that we're going to have our discussion today. Dr. Vine, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be with you today, Barry, and to be joining with all your listeners as well.
Thank you. Well, you know, I tell you, when it comes to religious freedom in the world today, there's a lot to talk about. And I'm just wondering if you could just share with us a little bit about the whole concept of where we got religious freedom. This is something that many people have forgotten today.
That's a great question. And so the modern concept of religious liberty, and even for secular people, the issue of liberty of conscience, we can trace directly back in the West to Martin Luther. Now, in the early 1500s, Martin Luther, who was an Augustinian monk in Germany, he posted his very famous 95 Theses on the castle door of the Wittenberg Castle Church. And in addition to those 95 Theses, when Luther argued against indulgences and various other papal abuses, in the course of his lifetime of writings, Martin Luther, his major contribution to religious liberty was to essentially say that a man can come before God directly in confession and in repentance and receive the gift of salvation and receive the gift of the Holy Spirit to lead us on a daily basis without the need for the intercession of a ecclesiastical hierarchy. That is a hierarchy of priests or pastors or bishops. And he argued this based on his interpretation of the Word of God. And thus the conscience becomes the meeting place between man and God. And we today, as Christians, are to be guided by our conscience and through our understanding of the gospel. This was a radical concept in his day, because back in the time of Luther in the early 1500s, if you wanted to confess your sins, you had to go to the confessional in the local Catholic church. If you were sorry for your sins, the priest would say ego te absolver. That means I absolve you of the guilt of your sins. And then the priest would prescribe a penance for you. That is, you were paying for your sins, and you had to make things right with God. You could not be buried or baptized or married without the permission of the church.
Right. And
if you were excommunicated, that meant that you could neither be buried, married, or dedicated or consecrated as a child. And theoretically, that left you living today, but going to hellfire tomorrow and for the rest of eternity. So Luther's revolutionary contribution was to say that you and I and all of our listeners listening to this program can come before God directly in the name of Jesus Christ, and as the Apostle Paul says in the book of Hebrews, to receive grace and mercy to help in our time of need. That when I come before God, I do not need to go through a pastor or a priest or a monk or a bishop or an archbishop. I can come directly to God, and God reveals himself to me. And so that was the revolutionary contribution of Martin Luther, over and beyond the idea of righteousness by faith. And by faith alone and by grace alone. Now, Martin Luther's ideas were then picked up a century later by an Englishman called Roger Williams. Now, he was born in the early 1600s in England, which, like America today and like Canada and like much of the West, was a bitterly polarized nation. And so he escaped that polarization, and he came to Massachusetts colony in, I think, 1631. And when he came to Massachusetts colony, he was invited to be a preacher. And what he noticed was that the Puritans had escaped from England and from northern Holland as well, because they disagreed with the teachings of the Church of England and the attempt by the Church of England to impose church doctrines on everybody, whether they believed them or not. But when the Puritans came to North America in the early 1600s, they in turn sought to impose their moral view of society on society using the civil magistrates. Mm-hmm. And so Roger Williams rejected this. And so because of this, he literally had to flee for his life in the middle of winter in 1636. And because he'd become good friends with the local Native Americans, or First Nations, as you call them there in Canada, the Narragansett people, they took him in, they sheltered him, and he went on to establish the modern-day state of Rhode Island based around Providence. And so Roger Williams, he took Luther's arguments a bit further. He argued that your conscience is a gift from God. It is God's voice within man. It's how God communicates primarily with us. Now, God also communicates with us through natural revelation, such as the nature and the natural world around us. God also communicates with us through sanctified reason. But the primary means by which God communicates with us is through our conscience. And therefore, the conscience is the link between man and God, and it is therefore sacrosanct. And it is particularly important because it is how we find our pathway to salvation. And so to violate the conscience of another person, regardless of their background, is to violate their inherent dignity as a man or woman or boy or girl created in the image of God. And so therefore, it is incumbent upon society, and this is the argument of Roger Williams, to honor, respect, and uphold the conscience of every man and woman, boy and girl who lives in that society. Now, Roger Williams was really revolutionary because he didn't just say that we are to uphold the conscience of every Protestant in North America. He went a lot further than that. He said, yes, we're to uphold the conscience of the Protestants and the Puritans, but we must also respect the consciences of the Native Americans, such as the Narragansett peoples near where he lived. He also argued we should uphold and respect the conscience of the Catholics, from whom the Puritans had fled, and the Anglicans, from whom the Puritans had fled, and also what he called the Turks, by which we would interpret the Muslims today, and the Jew. And so Roger Williams was really a very radical individual. And in order to protect conscience, he argued that because historically, when there is a fusion of church and state, the Church of England in England, or the Greek Orthodox Church in Greece, or let's say Islam in Saudi Arabia, which is a union of mosque and state, or the state really is an expression of the mosque, he argued that there is to be a complete separation of church and state, that the state's responsibility is to deal with civil matters, and the church is to deal with spiritual matters. We must avoid at all costs collaboration or cooperation, at the very least, or at the very most, the union of church and state, because inevitably the majority will persecute the minority within a given situation. Now, the net result of this, and this is really important for us today, within modern Western societies. You're in Canada, Barry, and I'm down here in the United States. And tolerance is held to be a very high virtue in both of our nations. And across the West, tolerance is held to be extremely important. And what's interesting is that it's Roger Williams who really first argues for the need for tolerance based on society's obligation to respect the conscience of every citizen within that nation. And so the concept of tolerance really is a Protestant concept in order to uphold the rights of conscience of every citizen within a nation. Now, those citizens may disagree with one another, but they still have a responsibility to tolerate, that is, to not trample upon and to not harm or not to deny the conscience of their fellow citizens. Now, in the last 200 years, that concept of tolerance has evolved. With the sexual revolution, tolerance has come to mean tolerance for different sexual orientations and gender identities. But that's not where the concept of tolerance originally came from. It was moored in a Protestant understanding of Scripture, and that concept of tolerance has grown over the years into something that maybe Roger Williams would not recognize today, in which tolerance essentially means you must agree with the new revolution around us, or you will be cancelled. And that's something that was completely anathema to what Roger Williams was arguing. So we in our modern societies are the inheritors of this this spiritual inheritance from Luther and Roger Williams, and we are blessed by this spiritual inheritance. What we see happening in the West today, that concept of tolerance has veered off into a different trajectory, and it's actually manifesting itself in a lack of tolerance for whoever disagrees with today's dominant narrative, which is not what Luther or Roger Williams intended. So that's kind of some of the basic history there, Barry, and it's very interesting. And I think it's important that we reflect on our history in both of our nations, because if we don't know where we've come from and don't understand where we've come from, then it's easy to be misled today.
Right on. That is a fantastic presentation. I just want to thank you so very much for that, because I think it is important for us to, as you say, to understand our history, where we came from, so we can understand where we are right now. One of the things I just want to go back to Luther and I have some other questions as we look at the history of all of this, but we look at Luther. Luther, when he stood up and, he said that there was no way he was going to break his conscience, for to go against the conscience is neither right nor safe. And, he was only going to be, unless he could be convinced by scripture and sound reason, right? That was his speech there at the Diet of Worms. But when he was making that argument, it was a lightning bolt that went through the society at the time, but it had not only a religious implication, but it had a societal implication. In other words, he was challenging not only the church, but he was challenging the state on that point.
Yeah, that's a really great point you make there, Barry. And, when Martin Luther wrote his theses, you might say Germany was primed for a major social change,
right? Because
for decades, Germany had been used as a cash cow by the papacy in Rome in order to fund the mostly the Italian popes' building projects and their foreign wars and so forth. There was massive corruption in the church, so you could buy yourself a bishopric or pay money and become an archbishop. And if you made a donation to the church, you would get given a gold-encrusted thorn from the crown of Christ, and such kind of indulgences and relics were passed your way. And so the German people were becoming very tired of being used as the milk cow for the Holy Roman Empire. When Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door, there was already movements towards German nationalism. That is, we don't want to be ruled by the Pope in Italy, nor by his appointees, those who paid him money or bribed him. Mm-hmm. So there was, the German princes who sat in the Diet of Worms, the electors, those are the German lords, nobles, and dukes who elected the Holy Roman Emperor. They were all jealous of their position, and they were sick of paying taxes to a foreign power, that was the Pope down in Rome. Secondly, when Luther wrote his theses, he was primarily objecting to the doctrine of indulgences, by which, there was a friar going around Germany called Tetzel, very famous story, and he would stop in a town and say to people, look, the moment your coin tinkles in this box, your relatives are released from purgatory. And this was being used to finance the building of St. Peter's Basilica or Cathedral, which is right now in Rome. That was financed primarily with German money. And so people were getting tired and sick of this kind of nonsense and of the corruption in the church. Now, the second thing that we say about the Diet of Worms was that it's interesting. Martin Luther was a monk. He was an Augustinian monk. And when he first wrote his 95 Theses, he was going through the ecclesiastical channels. The chief leader of the Augustinian monks was commanded by the Pope to kind of sort out this monk, and he couldn't. And this should have been dealt with as an ecclesiastical matter, because he was a monk protesting against papal abuse of power and corruption. Mm-hmm. But what was really interesting about it is that Luther managed to get his case heard at the Diet of Worms in the first place, which was a secular gathering. It was like Congress or the Canadian Parliament, rather than going into the court, the judicial system. And so the Pope and his cardinals originally argued that Martin Luther should be tried by a papal tribunal, where, of course, the outcome was inevitable. He would be condemned as a heretic and burned at the stake. But in the 6 months up to this, up to the Diet of Worms, Martin Luther managed to appeal to the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, and really by a miracle of God's grace, his case was heard by the Diet of Worms, which was a secular court. And rather than the cardinals coming and assuming the right to just execute Luther because they didn't like him, Luther had the right to defend himself before the nobles and the electors of the Holy Roman Empire. And that actually was one of the first times in history for maybe five or 600 years that the papacy had agreed that an internal matter would be subject to civil oversight. And that was a huge issue because today, when there is corruption, let's say within a given church, we expect that there is redress within the civil courts. If somebody steals money from the offering plate, if somebody abuses a child, or whatever the case may be, tragic though these situations are, we assume in modern society that you can seek redress through the police and through the judicial system. But up until Luther, that wasn't the case.
Would it be the case, though, that Luther was a ecclesiastical matter in the sense that it was dealing with theology and not dealing with, stealing money or any of those kinds of things that we would normally think today would be a civil matter?
Well, that's absolutely right. And, if you consider the condition of the priests and the monks at the time of Luther, where debauchery, alcoholism, abuse of all kinds was rampant, and they weren't being touched by the Pope. But the problem with Luther was that he was striking at the heart of the indulgences, at the financial cash flow of the papacy. Even though he raised it in a theological matter, the implications, what he was saying was going to cut the cash flow to the papacy dramatically if the sale of indulgences was banned. Yes, he was a monk. He was arguing along ecclesiastical matters, but because there was a serious possibility he would be executed or burnt at the stake by the papal courts, he appealed to the Holy Roman Emperor and said, "Look, I may die in this process, and I'm German, and I'm a German citizen, and I appeal to the Emperor, not to the Pope."
Right.
And so it was revolutionary, not just what Martin Luther said at the Diet of Worms, but for everybody listening today, the assumption that you have the right to go to a civil court for redress of grievances also goes back to the Diet of Worms, where the papacy had to argue its case in front of a civil court. They were not judge, jury, and executioner. Now they had to be one of the plaintiffs in the case, but they couldn't make the final determination. And then the third issue with the Diet of Worms was that, as you rightly say, that we were starting to move at the end of the Middle Ages. Some call them the Dark Ages, and the Enlightenment is just starting to appear. And in Italy, the Enlightenment has been going on for a century, and there was a big focus on the study of antiquities and ancient documents. And in Northern Europe, where Luther was from, Germany and then Rotterdam and Holland, of course, there was a much greater focus on the restoration of reason over superstition. And so had Luther been, let's say, 50 years earlier, maybe his case would not have attracted the attention that it did. But because the Enlightenment was starting to push back on the shroud of superstition that had been covering Europe up until then, so his appeal touched a chord with many of the free-thinking people in Europe. And the final thing that made his case so significant was that just like today, they had an information revolution or a communications revolution literally 20 years before Luther comes along. And that's the advent of the printing press. And had Luther's books, his pamphlets were published, they were sent all across Europe. This was revolutionary because before Luther and Erasmus and Gutenberg, if you wanted to learn something, you had to take time out of your life and go to a major university such as Paris or Rome in order to study, because that's where the scrolls were. And only the very, very rich could do that. But with the advent of printing, knowledge could be disseminated across the entire continent very cheaply, so that a plowboy could read the scripture and could read arguments from Luther just as much as the King of England could. And so we today are also living in a world where there's a rise of nationalism in different countries. We're also seeing in the world today a communications revolution, where the traditional hierarchies of our Western societies are appearing more and more should we say, antiquated and unable to cope with the realities of an information age and an information revolution. And we're also facing a world in which more and more people seek redress through the civil courts. And so, in a sense, we're living in a very similar era to that in which Martin Luther lived. And just as his era was revolutionary, so I think we are living in a revolutionary era today for the whole concept of civil rights, human rights, and liberty of conscience.
Okay, great points. And one of the things we'll want to just chat about as well is how in the modern age we're getting the establishment fighting back against this information age with respect to the internet and determining what people can see and not see with respect to any what is seen to be a controversial position. Whether we saw that with the COVID-19 cutting back information that people can read or not access or even be able to present something, videos being taken down and that kind of thing. Roger Williams really, I think, we haven't really, I think as a society, North America and here in Canada, we've always kind of seen ourselves as being distinct and different from the United States. And so as a result, we haven't really paid attention to some of these deep thinkers when it comes to conscience. And Roger Williams was certainly one of them. I wrote an article a while back dealing with Roger Williams and his influence on the English law and how really his thinking nevertheless comes to Canada through the understanding of the British common law system and the parliamentary democracy and all the rest. Because Roger Williams, of course, is, as you point out, he's a product of his time, a product of revolutionary thought where there's been huge amounts of discrimination and persecution of dissenters in England. And then he is involved in this uproar in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And I find it fascinating that Roger Williams would expand the notion of conscience to include such a wide scope. And the reason is that because a lot of people talk about the education of conscience. And so this becomes something that a lot of theologians and even in the legal community today, we talk about, okay, so we recognize that there's freedom of conscience. Our Canadian Charter in Section 2A says that we have freedom of conscience. But the question is, how does the law deal with that? Because somebody's conscience may be unreasonable. And so the law talks about, well, can there be a justifiable limit that's reasonable on that conscience? And I don't know if you could answer this question, but what would Roger Williams say with respect to reasonable limits to conscience?
Well, that's a really great question. And, I don't presume to speak on behalf of Roger Williams here today. I've never had that conversation with him, Barry, although I would love to have asked him that very question. With my gray hair, it may look like I come from his era, but no, I think that the starting point for Roger Williams, particularly the concept of tolerance, it starts with him seeing the suffering of the Native Americans or the First Nations on the edges of the Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Right.
And as a born-again Christian, he realized that the Epistle of 1 John says, chapter 3 says, essentially, if I paraphrase it now, if anyone looks at a brother or sister in need and has no pity in their heart, then the love of God is not within them. And just to paraphrase what the Apostle John says there. And so what we consider to be a champion for religious liberty, Roger Williams started out as a man who loved his neighbor like himself. And that caused him to become a friend of the Narragansett people. He studied their language, he studied their culture, he studied their history, he learned their botany, their survival skills. He wrote a book, and your listeners can download it online. It's called A Key into the Language of America. That's what it's called, A Key into the Language of America. It's freely available online. And this was the first detailed study of a Native American people. He championed them in Parliament in the UK when he saw that they were being unjustly tricked out of land in the land treaties that were happening.
Yes, I think that was amazing.
he was an advocate for the oppressed very early, very soon after he came across to Massachusetts, and he saw what was happening with the Native Americans being tricked out of their land by the Puritans. Now, why is this significant? Because Roger Williams understood that unless there is love for your brother, there can be no real respect for your brother. If there is no love for somebody else, then we treat them in a utilitarian viewpoint and in an instrumental way, but we really don't have a concern for their well-being. But if we are motivated, as Jesus taught us, to love thy neighbor as thyself, that means what I want for myself is what I want for my neighbor, regardless of whether they look like me or speak the same language as me. And so, motivated by love for his neighbor, Roger Williams became a champion for others who did not look like him and had very, very different cultural backgrounds. Now, this, of course, raises the question about where is the limit of conscience? Because different cultures have different understandings, they have different norms when it comes to, for instance, mental health. For instance, different societies have got different bell curves of what is considered normal behavior. So I haven't asked Roger Williams that question, but how his writings have affected America are that, if I may answer from an American perspective, his writings had a powerful influence on the writing of the First Amendment, that Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion or the free exercise thereof. Now, that is a direct reflection of Roger Williams's writings, but that the people in America do not have the absolute right to practice freedom of conscience. Let me give you an example. The US Supreme Court held that child sacrifice cannot be practiced in America as part of your religious rituals. And why is that? Because you cannot sacrifice a child and say, this is my religion. This is not a reasonable interpretation of freedom of religion. But even that interpretation of the limits of religious freedom is informed by a biblical worldview that says, thou shalt not kill. And so when we understand liberty of conscience and freedom of conscience, how Roger Williams understood it and how the US Supreme Court understood this for decades, maybe up until the last 30 years, was through the lens or the worldview of a Christian worldview, which upheld the sanctity of life and our responsibilities towards our neighbors. Because if we are to love our neighbors as ourselves, that means that there is a mutuality in society. That means if I hurt you, I must pay you compensation. That's a biblical principle from the books of Exodus, and in particular Exodus and some in Leviticus. So there is compensation, there's mutual responsibility, there's respect for geographical boundaries between land and also for social boundaries. And so these are biblical concepts that have informed how the US Supreme Court has understood the First Amendment. And I can't speak for how it's informed you up there in Canada, Barry, but with the rise of a secular worldview in the West, an aggressively secular worldview, then the foundations of Western liberal democracy, our concepts of tolerance and freedom of conscience and freedom of religion, are being eroded. And so now you have, let's say, the form of religious freedom, but the spirit of it is steadily dissipating in front of our eyes. And that's a tragedy for everybody, because once you eliminate freedom of conscience for all citizens in your nation, what you are then left with is the majority imposing its view on the minority on any given issue.
Right.
And historically, we know that when a society boils down to the majority forcing their view on a minority, then you're going to have trouble. And to give you an example of that, the Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln spoke, after the Battle of Gettysburg, and he says, there is no other way that we can hold our union together. I'm paraphrasing him, because Lincoln understood that if you have a nation of, let's say, 100 electors, and 51 vote yes and 49 vote no, let's say the 49 go their own sweet way and form their own republic, then those 49 have their own elections, and 26 vote yes and 23 vote no to something, then they'll split again. And then you split and you split and you split, and eventually the body politic collapses in and of itself. And so if the majority forces its way on the minority every single time, they may win today the battle, but society loses the war to hold together as a cohesive whole, in which for generation to generation, the rights and the consciences of all citizens are respected. And so you might say it's a Pyrrhic victory to force your view on society, because the consequences are horrendous. So I've given you kind of a long roundabout answer, but I think the essence of Roger Williams' view is that if you love your neighbor as yourself, with the teachings of Jesus, Matthew 7, verse 12, which is the golden rule, and if you love your neighbor as yourself, then you will voluntarily restrict, out of love for your neighbor, your exercise of freedom, whatever that may be, because you don't want to harm your neighbor. And that's a Christian principle. Where the Apostle Paul said it this way: all things might be legal, but they're not necessarily beneficial. And so it may be legal for me to do something, but it's not beneficial for society for me to do it. And so the Christian worldview isn't just about my religious freedom to do things. It's also about my moral responsibility to not do things in order to not hurt my neighbor. And that's where your conscience guides you and says, hey, Conrad, you have the right to do this, but it's not necessarily a good thing for society for you to do this. Therefore, to avoid your younger brother stumbling, see that he may see you as a bad example, or you may hurt him directly or indirectly, it's better for you to voluntarily not do something because that's better for society as a whole. And that's the principle of restraint. And so with religious liberty, there's also religious restraint in order to do not just what is good for me, but what is good for society. So it's kind of a roundabout answer I've given you, Barry, but when we get to heaven, I'm going to ask Roger Williams that whole question.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, it's one of those things, of course, that we're dealing with all the time in the law is this whole concept of, just exactly where is the line, where's the boundary for that reasonable limit. And I think that's a beautiful answer. And it's certainly one that in many ways illustrates how the courts themselves they haven't been using any kind of reference to scripture, but they've been trying to, find their way through this. But here's an interesting thought that comes to mind when you think of Roger Williams and his amazing witness to the reality of humanity in the new America, or they called it the New World, but it was there a long time. But anyhow, the reality is that today, in our current culture, there's this idea of colonialism that has come in, whereby everyone, unfortunately, are now being labeled based on their identity. And there's various means of identity, but one is race. And we hear a lot about different arguments being made that, the white colonialists that came over, or the Europeans that came over, they ended up forcing their will on the First Nations people. And here we have an example of an individual who recognized from his Christian understanding that no, the Crown does not have the authority to grant a grant in an area belonging to the First Nations people, because the First Nations people have not given that authority to the Crown. And that certainly did not put him in good stead with the other colonialists, but it's a wonderful testimony to the fact that in reality, it's a lot more complex than just simply saying, the British came over, they took over the land, they pushed everyone away. It strikes me that narrative falls flat when we have examples like Roger Williams.
I think you make a valid point there. And I recently did an online course. I think it's called the Four Seasons University in Canada. It's 4 Seasons of Reconciliation. And it was very interesting looking at the history of the last 300 years up in Canada there. And what happened is a very sympathetic retelling of history. Now, I was very intrigued by one of the First Nations leaders who spoke there, because he basically said, well, people came to our territories and they conquered and they killed and all the rest of it. And he said, but people need to realize that this land was given us by God. And therefore, we have rights to it. Now, it's an interesting concept, that, because I don't think that secular individuals anywhere in Canada would agree that God has given anybody the right to own a plot of land. And yet that was the basis in that online program for why a certain First Nations group had a right to a certain piece of land. And so what I saw in that discussion there was that we're actually talking about these issues from very, very different perspectives and actually with different worldviews. The secular worldview does not allow for the fact that God gave anybody any land, but the First Nations or Native Americans' concepts, in some cases, are that God indeed has given them the right to certain land. And so these are mutually exclusive worldviews. That there is no compatibility between those things. So while we may promote cross-community harmony and understanding and peacemaking, and it takes courage to make peace, we must also go a bit deeper than that and ask about the underlying assumptions as to, does God exist? And if God exists, am I responsible for my brother? And just like, the first murderer we find in the scripture was Cain. He killed his brother Abel, and God said to Cain, "Where is thy brother?" And Cain answered back. He said, "I don't know." He says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Now, God doesn't answer that question, but the question was answered in the original question, which was, "Where is your brother?" So the answer really is, no, you're not your brother's keeper, you're his brother. And you have a familial responsibility to him by virtue of being created in the image of God. And therefore, we're all accountable to our Creator for how we treat our neighbor. So we have to not just ask the surface questions about intercommunal relationships, but we must go deeper and say, well, what are the fundamental assumptions we bring into this conversation? Because the land was given to us by God is not an argument that any secular judge is going to uphold anywhere in America or in Canada. And so those are deeper issues that need discussion and sensitive listening, because we do come from very different worldviews to these discussions.
I'm just curious, where was that course? What school or?
I think it was called the 4 Seasons of Reconciliation. And the Adventist Church in Canada asked all of the leaders of Adventist ministries in Canada to go through that program.
Okay.
And I think it was called 4 Seasons of Reconciliation. It was very, very well done. It was very informative, very educational, but it also revealed very, very different worldviews in this discussion.
Those concepts that you raise are ones that we have seen in the history of law. The early cases dealing with that comes up in tort law, what we call tort law. In other words, tort is the idea that you have done a wrong to somebody. And the courts have used this idea of being your brother's keeper, or as your neighbor's keeper, if you are involved in doing something in your own land. For example, you in your construction of a dam, the dam gives way, water just floods down on the neighbor's property. There's going to be, the term is negligence, that you have a duty to protect and to foresee that this action was a risk that needed to have been thought of, and you've got a responsibility. Now, what's fascinating is in recent years, there has been in judicial decisions itself, various references by justices who have said, we no longer need to have any reference to the biblical literature or any reference to religion, because we are now a more enlightened society and we no longer need that. And I find that absolutely fascinating, because it's ignoring the deep cultural presuppositions and assumptions that have made our society possible. And so understanding where we get the freedom of conscience through that cultural milieu that made us who we are seems to me a very important thing for society to kind of have a look back and recognize where we've come from.
That's a really great point. It reminds me of a very funny clip. Many years ago, a secular student stood up before Ravi Zacharias before he died, and he gave a long speech about how we've evolved and how we have Sigmund Freud and we have Nietzsche and we have all the modern philosophers, and we have evolution and Charles Darwin. And he concluded by saying, well, as we've evolved so much over the thousands of years or millions of years of human existence, as he put it, why do we still need to read the writings of men who lived in the deserts in camel hair tents? Why do we need to go back to the writings of Moses? Haven't we evolved beyond that? And there was a pregnant pause. And then Dr. Ravi Zacharias, he says, I have one question for you, young man. The man said, yes. He said, well, when you came out tonight to this program, he said, did you lock your front door? And the man said, yes. And the audience collapsed in laughter because they realized we haven't evolved. That in locking your front door, you are basically recognizing the problem of human depravity, human fallenness, human evil. And the very fact that you locked your front door proves you don't believe what you're talking about. And the audience just collapsed in laughter. It was at a large secular university, I think, in the United States. And I think that illustrates your point that the promise of modernity in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s was that scientific progress would ease all human ills. And just in the Canadian context, you see that in the Avonlea series, Prince Edward Island, is it?
That's correct.
The family in Avonlea. My daughter liked watching those, and then they're debating, shall we have running water in our town, or a developer comes along and wants to give them electricity. And there's a character there called Jasper Dale, I think, who's always experimenting with gramophones or telephones and things. And throughout that series, you have this ethos that says that progress is good. And progress will reduce human suffering, as if progress is somehow a neutral thing. But then the series concludes just before or at the beginning of World War I, and all the horrors that brought with the advances of industrialization and technology. And as a result of the horrors of modernity and industrial scale slaughter, we now have post-modernity. I think that when secular judges say we want to do away with this Christian heritage in our Western nations, I think they are not recognizing the reality of human nature. And human nature is that, starting with me, I'm a fallen human being in need of God's grace on a daily basis. And without God's grace, I have no way of overcoming my fallenness. And it is only by the grace of God that I can put aside what the Apostle Paul called the works of the flesh, drunkenness and rioting and argumentation and all the rest of it. And I can put on the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, hope, peace, gentleness, self-control, and so forth. And those are the fruit of God at work within my heart and within my life. And so those are necessary for society to function, not the works of the flesh. And so, but in the West today, there's something more going on. And philosophically, it starts with the Frankfurt School of Philosophy that came to America in the 30s, which essentially was, Marxists, Jews fleeing from Adolf Hitler. They came to universities in America. They embedded themselves philosophically in the American and then the Western universities. And so now we have an outflowing of essentially Marxist ideology across the West. And the whole point of critical theory is not to, if you're an anthropologist and you want to study a people group, let's say taxi drivers in Calcutta, or, whatever the group may be, race goers in Melbourne, Australia, or you want to study pastors in Canada, whoever the group is, you realize that when you study them, people adjust their behavior at first according to how they think that the scientist wants them to behave. And then after a while, they lapse into their normal behavior. And so there is some bias there. But so in anthropology and sociology, you study societies in order to understand how they work. But in critical theory, you study societies in order to dismantle them, in order that you can replace them with a Marxist dictatorship. And it's called critical theory because Marx argued that we must ruthlessly criticize everything in our Western nations with the Judeo-Christian foundation in order to take away those foundations and then replace it with a Marxist or one-party authoritarian state, where you no longer have inalienable rights from your creator, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in America here, for instance, or you have inalienable rights in your Charter of Rights there in Canada, but you now have rights that are given by the state and they can be taken away tomorrow. And so depending on how the politicians think, you have rights today, but they're gone tomorrow. And so rather than the Judeo-Christian worldview, politicians are answerable to God for how they govern a society. In a secular worldview, politicians are answerable to themselves. There's no moral accountability. And whatever rights they decide to give to their citizens or take away, then there's nothing citizens can do about it. So the trend you're describing is actually quite scary for the civil rights and the rights of conscience of every group in Canada and in America, because sooner or later, you'll have the dictatorship of the majority rather than having Like in America, we have a constitutional republic, which protects the rights of minorities. When you shift to a pure democracy, the minorities no longer have rights. They can be trodden upon and eroded and taken away by the majority. So these are very scary social trends we're kind of touching on here, Barry. And it's something that, as a pastor, I speak up about, because when I speak up for civil liberties and freedom of conscience, I want civil liberties for my secular neighbor, for my Hindu friend, for my Muslim co-worker. I'm standing up for everybody's civil rights, because when we respect and champion a conscience and liberty for all citizens in our nations, then every generation is blessed by that. So I don't just champion my civil rights. My responsibility is to champion the rights of my neighbor, regardless of who he is or what he believes, because that way society can function with conscience for another generation.
I think that's very powerful. It reminds me of Martin Niemöller, of course, his famous poem. They first came for one group, then for the other, and then eventually, he said, I didn't speak up because I wasn't one of them, but when they came for me, there was no one for me. Yeah, and I think the struggle we're having right now is that part of this really Marxist ideology that's creeping into society now is they are using language that sounds very similar to what we have been using. For example, right now in the province of Ontario, there's a piece of legislation coming in that is going to make anti-racism as part of the curriculum, but not only part of the curriculum, but a whole new bureaucratic structure. It's going to have anti-racism experts who are going to be assigned to the various school boards. There's going to be a committee that will investigate whether or not racism has occurred and what punishment would be meted out to the offender. The definition of racism is quite interesting. It lists all kinds of anti-Black, and just lists it all, except it doesn't say anti-Caucasian, because the assumption is that just by the identity of being white or Caucasian, that you are of the racist group. Then it talks about equity. And again, so normally people would say, well, I mean, I'm anti-racist. I don't want to be involved in racism whatsoever. But you are going to be labeled a racist just by the identity that they hold you to be. And also they use the term equity instead of equal, treating everyone equal. And the concept of equal, we've often thought is, we use the term equal opportunity, that we are going to be treated the same under the law. We're equal before the law. But this concept of equity is being used in the literature to have the idea that, no, this is talking now about the equality of outcome. And that is a very different notion. And it's one that is going to cause even more trouble. And I'll just have one more point. And then that is, in many ways, our society has already been so primed for this legislation that it's getting almost unanimous support in the House, until finally some people have woke up to the reality of this legislation. Is now in second reading. So it's going to committee, which means it's only got one more reading and then it becomes law. You're not familiar necessarily with that, but you're familiar with the ideas that is being espoused here.
Yeah, and so I think that there is definitely racism in Western society. My sister-in-law is from Ethiopia, and I talk with my brother quite often about this, and she encounters casual racism on a daily basis here in the United States. It's just casual. It's just people just don't think anything of it. It's just normal for many people, and that's extremely painful. And so as Christians, we must reject any treatment or denigration of somebody else as being somehow less than simply by the color of their skin. Rather, we affirm that everybody is created in the image of God, and any attempt to denigrate or deny that image of God in somebody is to be completely rejected. But critical race theory is coming at racial relations from a Marxist perspective, not from a Christian perspective. There's an excellent writer on this. His name is James Lindsay. He has a website. I'd encourage your readers to look at it. It's called newdiscourses.com, newdiscourses.com. In there, he has some excellent discussions on what is critical race theory. And so, essentially, critical race theory began with the writings of Professor Derek Bell, Jr. He was the first tenured law professor at Harvard from African American. And he's now viewed as the originator of modern day critical race theory and is now being propagated by well-known individuals. And they write books which are national bestsellers, such as Robin DiAngelo wrote a book called White Fragility. You've got the revisionist history of the New York Times 1619 Project, which essentially argues that America was founded to perpetuate slavery. The anti-racist ideology comes from Ibram X. Kendi, who was a professor of anti-racism studies at Boston University. And you've got some others. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a very famous writer, Delgado and Stefanchik. They've written some major writings on critical race theory. Now, one of the challenges with critical race theory is it argues for equity rather than equality. And in liberal thinking, liberal democracy, we want equality before the law. And we give children scholarships from poorer families so that they have an equal opportunity in life to make something of themselves. And regardless of who you are, if you kill somebody or if you break the speeding limit or whatever the case may be, then you're going to get the same judicial outcome. Now, that's the theory. Now, critical race theory argues for equity, which says that regardless of who you are or where you come from or how much work you put into it, or how intelligent you are, or how lazy, or whether you inherit a fortune and invest it, or inherit a fortune and fritter it away on drugs and alcohol, society must work towards equalizing the economic and social and power outcomes across all ethnic groups in society, regardless of the individual's responsibility. And so this essentially moves you to a communist society, where the state guarantees for everybody the same minimum wage, the same minimum housing, the same minimum education. And it's essentially, it will overturn Canadian society if it gets passed. We see in America, in Virginia, they were pushing critical race theory in the schools. And a few months ago, there were some elections. And the parents were so upset about this, they voted out many of the lawmakers and voted in a Republican governor who then banned critical race theory in the schools because it was tearing societies apart. And so critical race theory has a number of tenets. One is the permanence of racism, that racism is absolutely everywhere. And your job is not to ask, is there racism? But your job is to describe how racism is manifesting itself in any given interaction. That means every interaction you ever have with anybody is viewed as a manifestation of racism. Critical race theory promotes what is known as storytelling. Critical race theory, for instance, it challenges the not the heteronormativity, but normativity of white European American culture, such as being on time, the value of hard work, and supporting a nuclear family. And critical race theory objects to this, and it promotes storytelling by oppressed minorities to challenge the dominant white supremacy, as it's called, and the social construction of race. Critical race theory also rejects the Enlightenment and the concept of a liberal Enlightenment. And so critical race theory questions equality theory. It rejects legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, meritocracy, colorblindness, standardized testing in the schools, legal reasoning, the neutrality of constitutional law, all of which are allegedly used to maintain white supremacy and therefore must be rejected. And of course, along with this is the idea that science is racist, mathematics is racist, and all kinds of things are racist because they are used to perpetuate white dominance in society. Perhaps the most insidious argument of critical race theory is what Professor Derek Bell called the interest convergence hypothesis. Now, the interest convergence hypothesis argued that advances for African Americans in the United States only happen when they coincide with the interests of the white majority. And therefore, white people who champion the interests of Black people, I'm speaking crudely here, but white Americans who champion the interests of African Americans are only doing so because it perpetuates the supremacy of whites in American society. And therefore, no actions of any white person on behalf of an African American can ever be trusted. This is a particularly insidious hypothesis that Derek Bell put out because it basically says that a white person can never do something that is right, ever. But a white person, even if they're acting out of Christian love for their neighbor and seeking justice, and they maybe have marched with Martin Luther King to Selma, or to hear his I Have a Dream speech, or who participated in the civil rights movement, even if you acted in good conscience to support your neighbor and to raise your voice against the Jim Crow laws and the systematic exclusion from the democratic process of African Americans in the Deep South, even that, you're acting to maintain white supremacy. And so
Roger Williams would be racist under that definition.
Well, absolutely. And then within critical race theory, another famous writer has written, maybe some of your listeners will know her, Kimberly Crenshaw, and she came up with the concept of intersectionality. She's most famous for that concept. Yeah. And so she argued that race, gender, and sexuality and these other identity markers are understood as cultural constructs rather than social absolute realities, but that oppression is experienced along all of these dimensions, and that race is the dominant factor relating to oppression within society. And so what we have within critical race theory is essentially a Marxist worldview that holds that there are the oppressors and the oppressed. So Marx argued that you have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie are the factory owners, the proletariat are the workers. And he talks about economic imbalances in society. Critical race theory talks about power imbalances in society, which is why the definition of racism keeps shifting. It used to be 30 years ago that racism was to treat somebody negatively or in a way that harmed them based on prejudice against the color of their skin. That definition no longer holds. Then it became, with the advent of critical theory, with the idea of oppressors and oppressed, and no longer are Marxists talking about economic imbalances, but they're talking about power imbalances in society. Now, racism only occurs when there is prejudice plus differentials of power. And so because it is held that white people, because of white supremacy theory, are in power at all times, therefore, by definition, only white people can be racist because they can be prejudiced and they're in power. Whereas an African American may demonstrate the same prejudice, but it cannot be considered as racism because African Americans do not hold the same positions of power in American society. So you end up with a situation where if you're a white person in America, even if you are given your entire life to the uplifting of your African American neighbor and the affirmation of their civil and social and legal rights, because of interest convergence hypothesis, you are viewed as merely doing this to maintain a white supremacy, and you can never do anything right. The net result of this is, how do you, therefore, as a white person, do you survive in a society that says you are guilty of all the evil of human history from the day you were born? Because that's a heavy psychological burden to place on young children as we teach them these concepts in schools. Well, the way that you get rid of the guilt is by becoming an ally. Very familiar, Barry, with the concept of allyship.
Absolutely.
That if you're an oppressor, you can get rid of all your guilt by just becoming an ally of one of the oppressed groups. So you may become an ally of the lesbians, the gays, bisexuals, the transgenders, LGBTQ or Q or Two-Spirit or whatever the gender identities are out there these days. And the list keeps growing. And it's interesting how this is playing out in schools. And for instance, the transgender phenomenon, it used to be that transgenderism was mostly men who believed that they were women. But in the last 20 years, that's all changed in America, at least. And I can't speak for Canada. In America now, the maybe 60 to 70% of all transgender cases are teenage girls. And you ask yourself, why are teenage girls suddenly wanting to become boys? Or why are they suddenly believing that they're boys? Well, there are a number of factors. Number one, the society holds up these impossible images of female physical perfection, in Cosmopolitan magazine and in Hollywood. And your average teenage girl is going through a period of physical transition through puberty. Mm-hmm. And she feels gawky. She may have acne. Her body isn't particularly well coordinated. She's growing and in various ways. And many teenage girls are extremely self-conscious about their physical appearance. And they look at boys, and there is no pressure on boys to look like Cosmopolitan magazine models. And so socially, it's easier for a girl to say, hey, I'm a boy, and then nobody cares how I look. That's the first factor. The second factor is with critical race theory and critical theory in general, because if you're a white middle-class girl, which is where a huge amount of the transgender girls are coming from in America, if you're a white teenage girl and you're taught that you are guilty of all the oppression in human history and nothing you ever do is ever right, I mean, that's a depressing thing to be told in school. But if you identify as transgender, on the hierarchy of oppression, transgenders are below African Americans, and they're below lesbians, they're below homosexuals, they're below bisexual individuals. They come below the ethnic minorities. Transgenders are the most oppressed minority, other than, say, Muslims are at the very bottom of the pile in the classic hierarchy of oppression. So if a white heterosexual teenage girl who's guilty of all the evil and oppression in human history, and therefore, is looked down upon, if she suddenly identifies as transgender, she absolves herself instantaneously of all the guilt of human history, because she's now further down the pyramid of oppression. And now everybody is oppressing her. And she is the victim of lesbian oppression, homosexual oppression, bisexual oppression, ethnic minority oppression, and so forth, and cisgender or heterosexual oppression. She is guilty of all the oppression of human history, and therefore she's treated as kind of like a social superstar. And so what we're finding in America today is, as critical race theory and critical theory expands in many schools, so many teenage girls are just taking the transgender option because they absolve themselves of the ideological guilt that critical race theory puts upon them. So there's a relationship between the two there. And this is a tragedy for the parents and a tragedy for the girls. And nobody wins in this kind of ideological battle. Critical race theory rejects the concept of truth. I say truth is a manifestation of white supremacy. It's a Euro-white construct. And so critical race theory rejects the gospel in favor of atheism, replacement of the biblical worldview with a Marxist worldview, overturning of sexual morality with sexual licentiousness. You might say the motto of the sexual revolution is, "It is forbidden to forbid." And under that kind of worldview, the Christian morality needs to be gotten rid of, because in the sexual revolution, anything that holds you back from the full expression of your sexual identity is viewed as bringing psychological harm to you. And because Christian morality is viewed as restrictive and saying you can and cannot do certain things, therefore Christian morality is the source of great social psychological harm. Therefore, we must get rid of it. Along with critical race theory, you have the elimination of freedom of conscience and worship, because in critical race theory, what matters is not the individual, but the group. And some groups are viewed as virtuous and some groups are viewed as villains. And so, we saw this in history. Joseph Stalin, he demonized the small-scale farmers in Ukraine in the 1930s. They were called kulaks. They were the small-holding farmers. They produced much of the grain of the Soviet Union. Stalin demonized them because he wanted to collectivize the agriculture, so he stole all the grain in the early 1930s. About 4 to 6 million people in Ukraine starved to death in a man-made famine at the hands of Stalin and his secret police. And he collectivized the farms in Ukraine at immense human suffering. And many of those kulaks were executed, they were deported, they were relocated, they were cleansed, they were put in concentration camps, and they kind of disappeared as a class in history. But in critical race theory, you are no longer viewed as an individual. You are defined by your group that you're in. That is your sexual identity, your gender orientation, or your racial group are the three primary groups that define you these days. And you are either guilty of all the evil of human history or you're a victim. And that gives you permission to act in certain ways that within the biblical worldview would be considered immoral. So I've given a long discussion of this here, Barry, but there are profound problems with critical race theory. I'm not aware of any society in the last 20 years that's injected critical race theory into its veins and has ended up being a more harmonious society. If anything, it will just increase the tribalism within our modern societies. It will result in ethnic and racial hatred and a huge psychological harm when we tell children that they're guilty by virtue of the oppressor's hierarchy. They're guilty of all the evil of human history, which of course they're not. And so while we reject critical race theory as Christians, we actively affirm that we stand for racial justice, and we stand for our brothers and our sisters, wherever they come from, in order that they might experience justice and equality before the law. And they do not have to experience racial epithets and racial marginalization. So as Christians, we affirm that we must stand up for in the face of racial injustice, but we also reject critical race theory because it's based on a Marxist ideology that will lead to human suffering.
As you are talking there, I'm sure many of our listeners will be nodding their heads because they recognize that this indeed is what is happening in our society. And it's going to have, as you pointed out, a very profound impact on our ability to be able to even communicate. Because when you have these basic assumptions, you're even trying to broach or discuss some of these issues. It's going to be your even questioning is in essence showing your racism. It's just a conversation stopper. I'm not sure how we can ultimately find our way through this. I wonder sometimes if this social experiment has to run its course before people finally realize this was a bad idea.
Yeah, I think that what's happening is that because our social elites in the West have really abandoned the gospel with its concept of social virtue, concepts such as duty and faithfulness and integrity. Financially, it used to be considered a virtue to save. Now it's considered financially good to be profligate in your expenditure and to take on debt. And so as our social and political elites have turned their back on God and turn their back on the gospel, the problem is you're left with a vacuum, and you cannot survive with a vacuum inside of you. And so as we've turned our back on God, so we have essentially opened the doorway to a Marxist worldview. And Marxism represents a very similar worldview to the Christian worldview, in the sense that Christianity has creation, and you have the fall, and then you have redemption. And Marxism has a very similar three-stage process. You have the evolutionary start of the universe, which was a classless society. The fall is private property and the creation of a class-ridden society. And redemption for humanity and for the universe will be the restoration of a classless society. And so you have a very similar, creation, fall, and redemption motif within Marxism as you find within Christianity. The attraction of Marxism is that there are no moral restrictions. And so you can do as you wish, which is, the famous Aleister Crowley, very famous Satanist in England, early 1900s, his motto was do as thou wilt. The motto of the sexual revolution of the 60s onwards is it is forbidden to forbid. And so as we reject God in our social and political elites, into that spiritual vacuum that is left, rushes in an alternate, which is the teachings of Karl Marx. And so the inevitable result of this is going to be human suffering on a scale that we've never seen before in Canada or in America, because Marxism is by definition totalitarian. It will accept no competitors. It will eliminate any competition. Even though it promises freedom, it ends up with, historically, Karl Marx's ideology has killed more people than any other ideology in human history. And so it's a sad, sad day, but we see this happening in our Western nations. And I think this is why some scholars, Barry, are talking about the rise of civilizational states. I know, for instance, what is Canada or what is the United States? I look north of the border and say, well, what holds Canada together? Is it the flag? Well, flag doesn't hold much really for many people. But what does the concept of Canada represent? And many of the rights in your charter come from an explicitly biblical foundation. But if you eliminate the biblical foundations among the social elites, then those charters of rights, that charter can simply be overturned because it's not based on anything.
Here's the interesting thing. At the very beginning of our charter, it says, whereas Canada was founded upon the principles of the supremacy of God and the rule of law. So, and then all of everything flows from there. So that's our preamble. But what's fascinating is that our judicial decisions on the charter has said, well, the supremacy of God clause means nothing, but the rule of law is applicable. What some scholars have been arguing, and I've had them on this program, talking about recognizing that the supremacy of God clause is really a recognition that we've had inalienable rights before the state. So there's the idea that really, when you look at it, the charter itself, which is only since 1982 that it became law. So we're actually having our 40th anniversary here of its enactment. But it had the view that human beings are fallible. In other words, you could make a law, but the law itself could be wrong. It's morally unjust. Because that's why, of course, we have the charter that says that all the laws must be subject to the charter itself. And that, in essence, is where some legal scholars have said we need to recognize that there has to be a humility in the law. But what's happening in the recent decades is the idea that no, humanity is above the law. In fact, we are so above the law that we can make law in such things. For example, right now, we have legislation that has passed that has now made it a crime for any discussion or very limited discussion when it comes to sexual identity, so that it's a crime to be involved in what they call conversion therapy. But conversion therapy is not defined in a narrow sense. It's actually quite broad. And we're going to see that unfold in the coming months, weeks, years. And I really feel that this anti-conversion legislation that has now amended our criminal code is part of this critical race theory mindset, where we have to not allow anyone to have any discussion on these obviously very controversial issues.
And that's a fair point, Barry. And just very simply stated, the worldview and the assumptions of, let us say, the LGB part of the LGBT community, their worldview assumptions are antithetically opposed to the T group within the LGBT community. If you are, for instance, in the homosexual community or the gay community, I'm not sure what's the currently respectful term to use because these things change all the time. But if you're a member of, let's say, the gay community, for argument's sake, let's say you're a gay man, and the assumption is that your sexual orientation means you have an exclusive sexual attraction to biological men. But then you have a woman comes along and says, I'm a trans man, and would you consider dating me? And you say, no, because I'm gay, I only date men. She says, I'm a man. Why aren't you going to date me? Are you transphobic? Are you guilty of a hate crime? And so with the LGB community, the assumption was that your sexual orientation was relatively fixed, and that to try and change it would cause you psychological harm. Now, I'm just saying that was kind of some of the theory, and that's, I think, as part of the idea behind your anti-conversion laws. But once you deal with the transgender community, if gender identity is fluid, then so must sexual orientation be fluid. And if your gender identity can oscillate through the day, which in gender theory, it can oscillate by the minute, then theoretically, so can your sexual orientation oscillate by the minute. And so we're now seeing a civil war in the LGBT community because at, say, pride parades, you now have lesbians, I'm defining them as biological women, females, who have an exclusive sexual attraction to other biological females. They're protesting at pride parades in countries around the world now, the erasure of lesbianism and the erasure of womanhood, because with the trans movement, you can no longer define what a woman is, and therefore you can no longer define what a lesbian is. And therefore, sexual orientation kind of falls away. So even within the LGBT community, there is a vicious civil war going on as we speak here in early 2022 about some antithetical philosophical assumptions that various members of the community bring to what is an orientation and what is an identity. And so Congress or Parliament or courts may pass these anti-conversion laws, but those anti-conversion laws fall apart when trans ideology is applied to them. And then the case is, what happens then? And so these are debates that are happening all around us. Yeah. J.K. Rowling is a very famous second-wave feminist in Britain. She wrote the Harry Potter series. She stood up for biological women as opposed to trans women. And she's been cancelled to a large extent, even by the fans of the Harry Potter series. And she's called a TERF. That's a new term of abuse, a trans exclusionary reactionary feminist. That is a biological woman who believes that you must be a biological woman to be a woman, and which was human understanding in every society for thousands of years up until about 10 years ago, until trans ideology took off. And so I'm just commenting here on the fact that today's today's ideology becomes tomorrow's hate speech. And these ideologies are moving so fast that people are voluntarily self-censoring. People aren't making comments on social media. They're afraid to talk about these things. They're afraid to publish, because what you publish today may be considered normal, but in 10 years' time, an internet archaeologist with a vendetta can dig up what was a perfectly acceptable statement, but in 10 years' time, it's now hate speech, and it's going to cause you to be cancelled. And the net result of this is that more and more across the West, people are self-censoring. They're not saying what they really think in public for fear that today's normal views becomes tomorrow's hate speech. And that's a tragedy, because if we can't share ideas, how else are we to learn from each other?
Right. And I think that's the takeaway here. We've come a long way from the Lutheran ideas of being able to stand up for your conscience, from Roger Williams' ideas of being able to expand that view of conscience to include everyone. And even now, as we think about it, the young people today talk about the white pill. What is the white pill here for us, as we recognize this very serious state of affairs that we're dealing with here when it comes to conscience, when it comes to being able to engage with your neighbor, being able to discuss things with your neighbor, being able to have freedom of speech and so forth. And I think we would all agree that it's becoming increasingly complex to be able, I use this term, we have a piece of real estate, in our case, we call Canada. And we got many different views, many different people, but how do we get to a place where we can live in civil peace on this piece of real estate? And that's the question that we've got to ultimately answer.
And this has practical consequences, Barry. So, for instance, I don't know in Canada, but in America, when you're a witness in a court of law, you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. I'm sure you have something very similar to that in Canada. If you're teaching critical race theory now to your children in Canada, you are saying to your children philosophically, there is no such thing as the truth. And therefore, what you do in your legal system, if the whole concept of truth is philosophically abandoned, what does the legal system seek to do? How does it function without a metric known as truth? You have your truth, and my truth may be completely disassociated from the facts, but I can no longer be charged with perjury because that's my truth, that's my subjective lived experience. Mm-hmm. And for you to question my subjective lived experience is known as a microaggression. And I need to live in a safe space, and a safe space in this new theory is a place where nobody challenges or questions my self-understanding or perception of myself. So if I believe that I'm a penguin and I'm going to a state university, nothing at that state university can ever question or challenge my self-understanding that I'm a penguin. And that means that any speaker who might question me must be deplatformed, can never speak at my university. Great example is Jordan Peterson with what he's gone through in Canada. Mm-hmm. That no ideas, no books, no movies can ever come on that campus because I might hear it and I might question or challenge my self-identity. And so when you start looking at the practical implications of these new ideologies that are sweeping the West, it's terrifying. And there's a joke in England, they say, that they swear in the witnesses and let the lying begin. Well, if we want to have a justice system where people are held to account for their deeds, and we want to have a justice system that functions so people have confidence in the legal system rather than just having a vigilante justice on the streets, then you can't get rid of the concept of truth from the court system. Once you get rid of the concept of truth, which is what critical race theory does, then your court system simply falls apart because you're talking about concepts that are philosophically rejected by society. So that's just one example of how these new theories are going to have profound social implications in ways that we have not yet seen. But what we do know is that it's going to be catastrophic.
As we move on in this, and as these ideologies are become more grounded into the ideas of the universities and the schools and so forth, it strikes me that there's going to be a lot of people. And I think this is one of the things I think was kind of a bit of a wake-up call, I think, with the whole truckers rising up against the prime minister, was the idea that you had these average men and women who are doing, trying to make a living and all the rest of it. And then they say, no, we're not in favor of this new law with respect to the vaccine. But it was the idea, it seemed to me, that the prime minister had a real rough time with the idea that such a large group, even though he called them a fringe minority, but there were literally, tens of thousands. And some said that the first weekend, it could have been as many as, 60 to 100,000 showed up on the first weekend. Such a large group that actually went against his ideas and his policies. And it seems to me that when universities are becoming more and more this way, that the average person are going to say, well, my tax money is going for this institution, and I'm supposed to be okay with that. And my child is in this school, and this is what's being taught. Maybe there's another way in which I can teach my child through homeschooling, through other private schools. And of course, as with everything with government regulation, they will now want to make this something that's going to be subject to the private schools. Now, I don't know what the legislation. I haven't double checked on that point, but that was one thing that I need to do. But one can see that the government is going to be expanding, and so it's going to be pushing more and more pressure on the blue-collar worker, the person who's not going to university, who's not accepting the ideologies. It is a recipe, it seems to me, for some very serious social struggle in the coming years.
I think it's a great point, Barry. We saw it in America with the rise of Trump. There's a basic divide in America. Young people go to university, no longer receiving an education, they're receiving an indoctrination in Marxist ideology. And then you have, you might call the working class, who don't have that, who do most of the essential jobs in society, without whom we could not function as a society, who are then looked down upon and sneered at by the social elites. And so there's a sharp division in society. And so the polarization continues. And we saw that in America. You saw it in your truckers' protests up there in Canada. We're seeing it in other parts of Western Europe as well. And it's just part of the fruit of a very divisive ideology that puts some people into good groups and other people into bad groups. And you have no control over those groups. You suddenly find that you are evil or good, depending on factors beyond your control. And this does not bode well for Western society. We see polarization all around us, and that's a tragedy, because we have to learn to live as a society with our brothers. We cannot view our neighbor as our enemy. If I view my neighbor as my enemy, I want to destroy him. But if I view my neighbor as my brother, I want to see him flourish in society. And so the Marxist ideology turns you into different groups, and other groups are your enemies, so you want to destroy. And the Christian worldview says your neighbor is your brother, and it's your responsibility to lift him up. And so we have to make that basic philosophical decision in our Western nations, or we're going to start falling apart. Right. And that's not a pretty prospect for anybody.
No, not at all. Well, wow, you've really given us a lot of food for thought. And we started out dealing with conscience. And I guess to tie it up and to just kind of encapsulate it here now, as we have many people with respect to their conscience who do have a truth, who understand based on the ancient book we call the Bible, is going to be one that's going to be wrought with a lot of, how can I say, nervous tension as to how they live their lives, how they are true to their conscience. And we're going to have to recognize that it's not necessarily going to be all that easy to be able to do that. But it is where we are. And hopefully we can keep the avenues of conversation going in order to keep ironing this out. But I mean, I hate to end on such a very a note of despair in some ways as to where this is leading us. But we do have to face the reality of it. And I think by recognizing it, that in essence is the important thing, because we need to be able to say, look, this is not where we want to go in our country, where we're going to be just so fractured that we can't even live together in civil peace. And so in that sense, it's important for us to realize it. And I think I think one of the things Canadians have learned from the last number of months dealing with the trucker incident is that there are more people out there who also think the same way as you do. Like, in other words, i.e., I had one young lawyer contact me recently, and she said, Barry, I was looking for somebody who's a lawyer who's speaking out on these issues because I just graduated from law school. And she said, I think I may have had only 3 courses in the entire 3 years of law school where I wasn't told about critical race theory and that I'm an evil person because I'm a white woman. And, I just like, wow. I mean, that's incredible. But anyhow, she said to me, I thought I was the only one. I thought I was the only one that wasn't accepting the views of what they're being taught. So that in and of itself, recognizing that, no, there are more, but we still have to find a way how we can communicate in a way that is respectful, even though we don't agree, even though we don't perhaps even understand where the other person is coming from, but we still need to be respectful.
Yeah, I agree with you. We have to find that way to live with respect to each other's opinions and convictions. And the foundation in America, and to a certain extent in Canada, of the concept of tolerance is based on a Protestant worldview. And as we eliminate that Protestant worldview, so rather than tolerating each other's views, you can have a prime minister saying that you have unacceptable views. Mm-hmm. And so as we eliminate the Protestant worldview, you have unacceptable views. If you have unacceptable views, the question is, what space is there for you in society? And we know where that kind of attitude leads. We've seen it in Europe in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and it's not pretty. Mm. And so there's something we need to pray about. And to the extent that I'm possible, and you're able to as well, Barry, we are to champion the conscience of our neighbor, because in championing the conscience of my neighbor, we preserve society for another generation.
Well, thank you so very much, Dr. Vine. I really appreciate your willingness to come and to talk about this very important subject. And for those of you who have been watching, I want to say that as you realize now, as we've been doing our videos, that you may not agree with the opinions that are presented here, but that's okay. That's why we have Freedom Feature. It is to be able to have a conversation. And we want to be able to continue that conversation. And so, Dr. Vine, I thank you for being part of our conversation. For those of you who are watching, I encourage you to just click that like button there, and because that just helps us in our ratings. And also, if you go over to our website at firstfreedoms.ca, you'll be able to sign up for our newsletter. Will you be notified of when our Freedom Feature comes up and when it's published, and also our other writings that's available there on the website. So until next time, I'm Barry Bussey. The fight for freedom consists not only in the legal battles in court, but also in the battle of ideas at the universities and in the media. It takes time, effort, and money to keep on top of the debates for freedom. Your donation allows us to keep fighting for all Canadians. Firstfreedoms.ca